Well, it's Tuesday, and we're still messing around with reverse loops and random phone calls from random people. This week, however, we're messing around with, let's call them hidden reversing loops or accidental reversing loops. When you get on the forums, when people are talking about electricity, I swear half of the questions are, how come my whole railroad is shorted out when I put in this crossover? Sometimes it's just very easy as you're laying track and building up a track plan to sort of accidentally put a reversing loop in there without even realizing that you're doing it. And I think one of the easiest way to figure out what's going on is to look at the double track dogbone, because those have reversing loops every time you have a crossover. So last week we were looking at this, which is my favorite track plan of all track plans, a single track dogbone. So trains are going in both directions on a single track with reversing loops at either end. And this is what I had in my backyard railroad years ago, and it's very easily automated so trains can go around continuously even though they're traveling on the same track. So in this case, whether they're heading for Durango or Rockwood, they're always traveling on the same single track. Now, what most people will do when they build a dogbone railroad is this: a double track dogbone. In other words, it's your basic loop railroad, just like the 4x8 sheet of plywood. It's just formed into the dogbone shape where the two tracks are brought together in the middle to form a double track. A lot of the big clubs that are doing modular railroading that they take to the shows use this track plan because it's very easy to have a loop module at one end of your railroad and a loop module at the other end of your railroad, and then double track in all of the other modules, and everybody that builds a module need only build a double track module. So these double track dogbone layouts, or just sort of double track railroads in general, are the most common kind of model railroad for big clubs, modular railroads, great big huge home railroads, and that sort of thing. And so for that reason, those are the kinds of railroads where you run into these, let's just call them unexpected and unintended reversing loops. Now, some clubs, groups, people will choose to isolate the loops at either end and then keep both tracks in the same polarity. But I think it's easier to just continue to treat it as a great big loop. But if we look closely at these double track modules, you can see that the polarity is opposite on those two tracks. It's still the loop railroad with the black rail to the inside of the loop, if you will, but that means you can't cross over from one track to the other without shorting the entire railroad out. So effectively what we have created is this track plan that we looked at, where we're just crossing through the middle of the loop, and so the solution for this is going to be similar. So if you recall, what we did with this track plan was isolate the entire loop on the right as well as the section that crosses through the middle and put that on its own reversing switch. And we did that because, remember, you have to be able to fit an entire train inside your reversing section. Otherwise, the metal wheels on your cars will short the railroad out as they roll across the gap. So how are we going to solve that problem with this track plan? It's not like we can fit the entire train in the crossover section. Now, we could isolate the entire east loop or the entire west loop and put that on its own reversing switch, and that would work. But boy, would that limit operations. And if we were running a big club, that would really be out of the question. Moreover, what would be the point? Why would you want to go through that reversing section and have your train go around in the opposite direction? It's sort of pointless. So this makes a lot more sense, and that's to have two crossovers And then that way you can treat one side of this as a siding for the other side. In this case, we could use the westbound track as a siding for the eastbound track. And that way a slower eastbound train could pull over into that siding, wait for a faster train to pass it, and then pull back out onto the eastbound main. Of course, we'd have to have switches facing in the opposite direction if we wanted to use the eastbound track as a siding for the westbound main. So, where do we need to cut our gaps in the rails, and how do we go about wiring this? Well, that's going to involve looking at a new subject, and that's called block wiring and cab control. And this is how we wired our DC two-track railroads forever and ever and ever back in the day, because it was the only way you could control multiple trains on a single railroad. Of course, today that's most often handled by installing digital command control, DCC, in the individual locomotives and running that from a digital command control throttle, and then you don't have to worry about having all these different blocks. It's really a big subject, and we're going to come back to it in a few weeks, but for now we need to understand some basic concepts of block control in order to wire these reversing sections. First, let's understand what we mean here. When we say cab, we simply mean a throttle from a power supply, and a block is any isolated track section. So any of these reversing loops that we've created can be referred to as a block, but they're a specialized block because they're on their own reversing switch. Moreover, they have to have gaps cut into both rails, where quite often with block control, we only need to isolate one rail. So reversing loops or reversing blocks are very unique. They're not like other electrical blocks. Now, anytime we're dividing our railroad out into blocks, whether they're for reversing or any other purpose, there's a concept we need to understand. And that's that a basic block, if it contains switches, as it almost always does, the point side of the switch needs to always face inward on the block. The frog side of the switch will always go to the outside section of the block. You can sort of think of it this way, that the power going to the block will mimic the direction of the train. Just as the train can only enter the switch from the point side of the switch, so the power should also enter from the point side of the switch. So this would be a very bad block design here. We would need to subdivide this further so that we don't have any switches facing away from each other this way. So this section over here could be a block, and in fact that block could carry all the way over to the right side here, but we'd need to cut gaps in the rail somewhere before the frog. And because we're doing a reversing section, we need to cut gaps in both rails on both tracks. This is what we're looking for, an isolated track section where all of the points face inward and the frogs are to the outside. And that can be as many switches as you want, as long as all of the points face inward. So let's get back to our double track dogbone, where we're using, in this case, a section of the eastbound main as a siding for the westbound main. And you can see our siding there, our siding section, is actually a block with gaps cut just beyond the frog on all rails. Now, that block is going to be wired as a reversing loop with a double pole, double throw switch to control the polarity. The polarity can then be aligned to the westbound main, and that will allow a train to pull into this block and use it as a siding. A faster westbound train can now pass the slower train, which is parked in the siding, and then that train can pull back out onto the westbound main. The polarity switch can then be realigned to match the eastbound main, and we're back to normal, and two-way traffic can proceed up and down the double track. Now, this particular arrangement only works well for westbound traffic, So if we want to be able to do the same thing with eastbound trains, all we have to do is add another crossover so that eastbound trains also can enter an isolated section, and then the two different sections can share the crossover in the middle. So we have two completely isolated sections with both rails isolated and each one on its own reversing switch, one for eastbound traffic and one for westbound traffic. Now on a regular DC railroad, the easiest way to handle that is just have these switches mounted on the front of the railroad near the isolated section. But on a DCC railroad, while the gaps have to be cut the same way and the wiring set up the same way, rather than having a toggle switch, you can connect that to a circuit board, a specialized circuit board that'll handle all of the polarity switching for you, and you don't have to think about it. All you have to do is align your switch points and run your trains. So the easiest way to think about this is we're setting up a block, a completely isolated block with both rails insulated just outside of the two switches, and the power coming from our reversing switch is being fed to anywhere along that section between the two switches, as long as it's in the section where the switch points are facing inward, facing where we're setting up our power feed. At that point, we can set our reversing switch to match the polarity of either the eastbound traffic or the westbound traffic. Well, there you have it, a little bit more on reversing loops. And as I keep mentioning, a lot of these things are very easily automated because people are going, I don't really want to have to keep track of all these switches. In DCC railroads, automating these reversing loops is very simple. In DC and AC railroads, not quite so much, but my single track dogbone was all automated, and that was a strictly DC railroad. So there are ways of doing it, and that's going to be the upcoming subject. Well, if you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. And one way or the other, please hit the like button. That helps direct our movies to you, and it helps direct other people to our movies as well. And the thing that will really promote the channel is if you hit the subscribe button if you're not a subscriber. And the easy way to do that is with the upcoming blue button. Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet, and we hope you didn't find it boring. And we will see you here on Sunday, because Karen and I have some fun stuff to show you. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.